We are going to look at the topic of hire purchase as a contract. Hire purchase as a contract. So hire purchase is actually one of the contracts you can actually be able to have. So it is a kind of a contract whereby we have two parties. So we have a person known as a hirer, and we have a person known as the owner of the goods. So it is simply an agreement or a contract under which a person known as a hirer so agrees to make what we call periodical payments by way of hire of maybe goods or maybe a property. So these goods are basically hired from a person we call the owner. So he's actually considered as actually being the owner because there's the aspect of whereby we are saying there's payment of there's the payment of periodical installments. So once these installments are actually through, that's when basically now the hire of the goods can actually be able to take over to your calling ownership. But during that particular period under which the hire purchase installments are actually being paid, these goods actually still belongs to the owner of the goods. It is simply a contract whereby we have two persons or two parties entering into an agreement whereby a person we are calling the hire of the goods agrees to make what we call periodical payments to the owner of the goods. So to the owner of the goods. So once the payments are actually basically cleared or basically they're actually through, that's when now we can actually have this person we are calling the hirer either having to exercise the option to acquire the goods or the property in the goods, or basically after the end of that particular hire purchase agreement or hire purchase contract, the goods can actually basically revert back to the owner. So there's actually an option at the end of the payment of the installments that this hire of the goods can actually be able to exercise the option to acquire or actually acquire ownership of the goods, to acquire ownership of the goods, to acquire ownership of the goods. So there's usually the option of either to purchase or maybe to return the goods, either to purchase or basically either to return the goods. So when the goods are actually basically with the hirer, there's something known as bailments. So it is like this hirer is actually basically bailing the goods of the owner of the goods, because he'll basically maybe have the goods in his premises, but basically like be holding them on behalf of the owner of the goods. So that is what we call bailment. So under bailment, which is almost related to hire purchase, it is simply where the hirer obtains possession of the goods, yet the goods remain in the ownership of the owner. So he obtains the possession. He's actually able to possess the goods as the bailee. But the ownership actually, basically the title in the goods still actually remains with the owner of the goods, still actually remains with the owner of the goods, the owner of the goods. So we are saying there's that option at the end of the hire purchase payment of installments or hire purchase installments having been paid, to be able to exercise the option either to buy or maybe acquire the goods for or the title of the goods. So what are the provisions, or basically what are the requirements with regard to what you are calling the hire purchase contract? So before the contract is actually entered into, there should be actually be the crafting of what we call a hire purchase agreement. So there should be actually crafting of what we call a hire purchase agreement, a hire purchase agreement. So these hire purchase agreements, it is simply now the instrument that will actually basically form the contract between these two parties we are calling the hirer and the owner. So part of what will actually be contained there, for example, it will be the description of the parties, their names, or maybe their addresses, or where they come from. This description of also the goods will actually also be contained in the hire purchase agreement. Which kind of goods are actually being hired? Is it maybe a piece of furniture? Is it maybe an electronic goods, for example, a television set, for example, a radio? So also the cash price of the goods basically will be revealed in the hire purchase agreement or contract. What we mean by the cash price, so in most instances, as you've learned maybe previously in mathematics or somewhere else, The cash price of the goods basically will normally be a bit lower when compared to the higher purchase price. So the higher purchase price, since you are paying slowly or actually in installments, the owner or basically the seller of the goods is likely to quote a higher purchase price that is actually a bit higher than the cash price. So what are the number of installments will actually also be contained there? What are the number of installments actually expected to be paid by the hirer while these goods are actually being hired? Then the amounts payable on each and every installments, and when is it actually due? Do you pay by 50th of the month? Do you pay by 30th of the month? Do you pay by mid of the month? It will actually also come out in the hire purchase agreement. So the amount to be able to pay and when it's actually supposed to be paid, you are saying should actually also be there. So the rights of the parties will actually also be indicated. So for example, what are the rights of the hire of the goods? What are the rights of the owner of the goods? So when you talk about the rights of the owner of the goods, that is actually supposed to get, for example, the installments when they fall due or maybe on time. If it is actually 5th, this hirer should actually ensure he has paid for those particular installments on the dates they're actually falling due. Then it must be signed by both parties. It must be signed by the hirer, or basically it actually also must be signed by the owner of the goods. So those will be part of the contents of the instruments that forms the contract between the hirer of the goods and the owner of the goods. So those details must actually clearly come out in the hire purchase agreement, So revelation of the cash price, details of basically the parties under the contract, the amount payable on each and every installment, and when does it actually fall due? What are the number of installments that are supposed to be paid? So description of the goods. So which kind of goods are actually being hired? So there's also the importance of ensuring that the hire purchase contract is actually registered. So there's what we call registration of the hire purchase contract. Registration of the hire purchase contract. Registration of the hire purchase contract. So for this contract to be valid or basically to be enforceable by the parties, it must actually be registered as per the requirements of the Hire Purchase Act, for example, in Kenya. So under that particular act or statute, it is a requirement when two parties enter into a hire purchase contract or agreement, it is actually supposed to be registered with the registrar of hire purchase contracts. So at the registrar of hire purchase contract, that's basically where now you can actually be able to register your hire purchase contract to make it valid, such that if there's any of the parties who defaults on his or her obligation, then it is actually quite easy to be able to enforce it. So it should actually be registered within a period of 30 days, as per the requirements of that particular statutes or that particular act. Then what will happen in this case when it is actually being registered, it should actually basically be formatted or should actually be put in what we call an English language. Then, of course, there'll be the requirement of having to pay a fee. So you'll pay what we call a stamp duty or maybe a fee before the hire purchase contract is actually registered with the registrar of hire purchase contracts. So the requirements, basically, it should actually be formatted or basically be crafted in an English language. Then, of course, it should be registered within a period of 30 days. Then, of course, also what is actually important is that there'll be the payment of what we call a stamp duty that must be paid before this particular hire purchase contract can actually be registered. So it is important for this particular contract to be enforceable. It must actually be registered. So failure to register the hire purchase contract, then it will lead to certain effects. For example, in this case, if it is not actually registered, the agreement cannot be enforced by any person against the hirer. For example, in this case, the owner cannot actually enforce it against the hirer. For example, in this case, if the hirer defaults on payments of the installments, it simply means that it will be seen as not being a valid hire purchase contract since it was not registered. Therefore, this owner cannot go to any court of law and actually claim that this hirer has defaulted on payment, and therefore the court can actually come up with what we call specific performance. The court won't do so because it is not actually a valid hire purchase contract because of the non-registration. Then a contract of guarantee under this particular hire purchase agreement cannot actually also be enforced. What we mean by a contract of guarantee is that we might have another party known as a guarantor under the hire purchase. What the guarantor actually does, in this case, for example, if the hirer defaults on payment of the installments to the owner, he can step in as the guarantor to be able to make the payment of those particular installments on behalf of the hirer. But in this case, if the hire purchase contract is not registered, what we are saying, this guarantee won't actually be valid. So it simply means that it will not actually be mandatory, or it will not actually be a must for this particular hire purchase contract to be enforced. So because this particular guarantor or this particular guarantee won't be valid because of the failure to register the hire purchase contract, contract. So that's what we are saying, or we're actually emphasizing. It is actually important for the hire purchase contract to be registered. Then another thing, or another effect. So see, remember what we've said. Number one, that this particular contract cannot actually be enforced against the hire of the goods by any person. Number two, any contract of guarantee under this particular hire purchase contract won't actually be valid, or won't actually be enforceable. It can't actually be enforced. Then we are saying also, number three, the owner cannot enforce the rights to repossess the goods from the hirer. So there's usually the right of this particular owner of the goods having the right to repossess the goods in case of default of payment. So in case the hire purchase contract is not registered, then that right of repossession is actually lost by the owner of the goods if the hire purchase contract is not actually registered. Those are some of the effects of non-registration of a hire purchase contract. We've said basically the owner cannot actually enforce it against the hirer of the goods. For example, in case of default of payment of maybe the installment. So another one, we've said any contract of guarantee under the contract won't actually be valid. Then also we are saying that the owner cannot actually be able to repossess or enforce repossession of the goods from the hirer in case of default in payment. So how is the hire of the goods actually protected under the hire purchase contract? Because sometimes you might find that maybe this particular hire of the goods has actually been able to pay for 90% of the goods, but you can actually be able to see that we are saying the owner has the right of repossession. So it simply means that 90% has been paid, but there's actually still that right of actually being able to repossess. So how do you protect the hire of the goods from such actually happening? How do you protect the hire of the goods from actually such having to happen? So the hire of the goods can actually be protected in a way that, for example, number one, making some of the content of the agreement to be void if actually used. Then number two, implied terms of the agreement. Then number three, repossession of the goods. So they can be categorized into those particular three categories of how the hire of the goods can actually be protected from the owner, or basically repossession of the goods by the owner of the goods. So number one, you are saying a provision which allows the owner or his agent to enter upon any premises to repossess the goods let under hire purchase agreement. Then another void provision is, for example, effects to relieve the owner from liability for such entry should actually be stated in that particular agreement or contract. Then provision which excludes or limits the hirer's right to terminate the agreement. So the hirer should not actually be limited, or should not actually be basically excluded to have the right to be able to terminate the contract or basically the agreement under hire purchase. So if things are not actually okay, or is not actually able to repay the amount within time, then it simply means that this hire of the goods can actually be able to terminate that particular agreement, So maybe I can just share part of it. So those are the contents you are saying that basically will be deemed to be void or not actually acceptable in a hire purchase agreement or contract. So if those ones are actually basically included, they'll be deemed to be void. So they shouldn't actually be included in a hire purchase contract. So if they're not actually included, or basically they have been stated not to be included, so that this hire of the goods can actually be protected from the owner of the goods. So we had just gone through number 3, which we are saying a provision which excludes or limits the hirer to be able to terminate the agreement. To be able to terminate the agreement. Then number 4, a provision which deems persons acting on behalf of the owner in the formation or conclusion of the hire purchase agreement as agents of the hirer. Then a provision whose effect is to relieve the owner from liability for acts of a person acting on his behalf in relation to the formation or conclusion of the hire purchase agreement. So those ones basically will actually be excluded or basically be seen to not to be valid, or they'll be seen to be void, even included in what we are calling a contract of hire purchase. Then what are some of the implied terms, or those basically terms under a hire purchase agreement that can actually be able to protect the hire of the goods? So the Hire Purchase Act implies both conditions and warranties in all hire purchase agreements. So what are the conditions? The conditions are that this owner of the goods will have what we call the right to sell. So there's actually an implied condition that the owner will have the right to sell the goods when the property is to pass, because we've said at the end of the hire purchase agreement, this hirer can be able to exercise the right to own the goods, or basically buy or actually acquire the goods. So it simply means that there's a condition, or actually implied condition, when that one is actually supposed to happen, this owner will basically have the right, or basically the property in the goods, to be able to pass to the hirer of the goods. Then the goods should actually be of what we call merchantable quality, or basically for expected quality. So unless the goods are second-hand and the agreement so provides, there's an implied condition that they would be of merchantable quality. So they'll be of a quality that is actually expected or can actually basically be consumed by the hirer, or basically the acquirer of the goods. They'll basically be fit for purpose. For example, if it is a television set, it simply means that you can actually be able to watch it without any disturbance. If it is a seat, or basically a sofa set, or basically maybe a table, it will be fit for purpose, or basically it will be for the expected purpose it's actually supposed to perform as a good from the owner of the goods. Then conditions may actually also be applied by any other law. So you could have conditions actually being implied by any law regulating such kind of a hire purchase contract or agreement. So what are the warranties? So by warranties, we simply mean that these ones, basically, it is not mandatory for them to be present for this hire purchase contract to be fulfilled or actually performed. But of course, they're actually very important and should actually form part of the terms of the contract. So number 1 is that this particular hirer will be able to enjoy what we call quiet possession. So enjoy the goods without any form of disturbance from the owner of the goods. So there's an implied warranty that the hirer will have the goods and actually enjoy the possession of the goods quietly without any form of disturbance. The goods will actually be free from any charges. So what we mean by charges or encumbrances? So the goods wouldn't have actually been used as a form of security by the owner. So there's not any other third party who has an interest in the goods. If it is a motor vehicle that has actually been hired, it simply means that there's not any other third party, for example, a bank, that has basically charged that particular property, or it has been used as a security to acquire a loan from the bank. So there's the expectation that these goods will be free from what we call encumbrances or charges. So then any other warranties can actually be applied by any other law that basically could actually be regulating such kind of a hire purchase agreement or contract. So repossession of goods. So under hire purchase contract, this owner of the goods has what we call right to repossess the goods in case of default on payment of the installments. So under the Hire Purchase Act, the hire purchase price has been, if the hire purchase price has been paid by the hirer or any other person or on his behalf, the owner cannot repossess the goods otherwise than by court action. This provision, if 2/3, so that's what they are saying, if 2/3 of the price has been paid, the goods cannot actually be repossessed other than by what we call a court action. It simply means that this owner of the goods has to go to the court and get a court order to be able to repossess the goods from the hirer of the goods. So this provision was intended to protect the hirer from the common law practice of matchback or snatchback, under which the owner will repossess the goods at any time. So you can't just repossess any time. So long as 2/3 has been paid, so you have to go to the court and get a court order, or basically be allowed by the court to be able to repossess the goods. If the owners repossess the goods in contradiction of the act, then the agreement will actually be terminated. The hire purchase agreement will be terminated. The hirer is discharged from all liabilities of the agreement. The hirer is entitled to recover all sums paid under the agreement or the contract of guarantee. So he'll have a right to recover all the installments he's paid, maybe up to even 90% that he had actually already paid. So the hirer is entitled to recover all the sums paid under the agreements. The guarantor is entitled to recover any sum paid under the contract of guarantee or under the security given. So as I've explained earlier, so what we mean by a guarantor is, for example, in this case, a guarantee contract that will be involved is whereby this hirer has involved a third party. In case he fails to pay, then the third party can actually be able to take over the responsibility of paying the goods or the price of the goods to the owner. So it simply means that if there's failure to observe the hire purchase act with regard to repossession of the goods, it simply means that all those amounts paid by the guarantor, for example, on behalf of the hirer, can actually basically be gotten back or basically can be recovered from the owner in case the requirements of the statute are not actually basically observed in terms of repossession of the goods by the owner. Then, so what are the duties of the parties? What are the duties of the parties? So the duties of the parties, what do you mean by duties of the parties? Of course, as I've said, under hire purchase, we have two parties. So you have the owner of the goods, and of course, you have the hirer of the goods. So what are the duties of the owner of the goods? So duty to notify the hirer of the cash price. So that is the duty they have. So they must ensure, other than the hire purchase price declared, what is the cash price? What is the cash price of the goods? So that this particular hirer can be able to compare as either to go for cash price or maybe choose to buy the goods under hire purchase. So the owner must send the hire purchase agreement to the hirer within 21 days of execution. Duty to put the hirer in possession of the goods under the hire purchase contract. So what do you mean by putting the hirer in possession? Basically, maybe to transport the goods to the premises of the hirer. Duty to compensate the hirer in the event of defective goods. So if the goods are actually very defective and they have basically been acquired by the hirer, because the hirer is paying for the price, that is installment price, then he has to compensate this hirer in case it is discovered that the goods are actually basically not in a good condition. Then the owner is bound to disclose to the hirer the defects in the goods or in the title. What are the duties of the hirer now? That other party, the one who is basically possessing the goods. So he has what we call reasonable care to ensure that the goods are actually basically taken care of. So it is the duty of the hirer to exercise reasonable care in relation to the goods let under the hire purchase agreement. For example, it is a motor vehicle which has been hired, to ensure that that particular motor vehicle is being used properly, and of course, it is basically in good condition in case of any recovery or any repossession that has to be done by the owner of the goods. Duty to take delivery of the goods or basically take over the goods once they have actually been delivered by the owner of the goods. Duty to pay for installments. Duty to continue hiring. So it is the duty of the hirer to continue hiring the goods for the agreed duration. The obligation does not deny the hirer the right to terminate that particular agreement. Notice of change of location of goods. So for example, if you've changed your residence or location, basically where you stay as the hirer of the goods, it is your duty to ensure that you basically inform the owner that you basically maybe change your residence in terms of where you stay, and therefore this particular owner of the goods should actually be able to know where he can actually be able to repossess the goods in case of defaulting in payment. So it is important the hirer notifies the owner of change of location of the goods, such that if the owner has to recover them, it will be an easy time for him to be able to know the location of the goods, of the goods. So what are the rights? What are the rights of the hirer? So the rights basically come almost from the duties of the owner. So he's entitled to be notified of the cash price. He's entitled to a copy of the agreement. He's entitled to be compensated for any loss. Entitled to what we call quiet possession of the goods. Entitled to any damages for breach of the contract. He has a right to terminate the agreement at any time before even the final installment actually falls due. So how will this contract come to an end? It can come to an end by simply writing a notice, or basically notifying the other party, or what can actually happen is what we call returning of the goods. So the hirer can return the goods, and therefore he won't actually basically be continuing hiring the goods in case he has already returned. So if he returns the goods, the parties' relationship actually comes to an end. By an agreement, any of the parties can actually be able to terminate that particular relationship. So once this is done, the depreciation clause or the minimum payment comes into play, in which case the hirer has to pay all installments due up to the termination of the agreement, the amount by which 1/2 of the hire purchase price exceeds the total amount paid, or such lesser amounts as the agreement may actually provide. So they might agree with the owner of the goods. Maybe he pays installments up to which particular points before he can actually be able to return the goods or terminate the agreement, or basically terminate the agreement, So that's basically what you need to be able to know about the hire purchase contracts. So hire purchase contracts, as we've said, we have two parties. So you have the hirer of the goods and you have the owner of the goods. It is simply where a person known as the hirer of the goods agrees to take possession of goods which are actually being owned by the owner. The title in the goods is actually basically with the owner, but he takes possession of the goods, and of course he has a right to be able to do what we call right to exercise the option to acquire the goods at the end of the hire purchase agreement. So he can either basically after the end decide that he's going to basically take over the goods for good and actually basically pay for the price of the goods to the owner of the goods, and of course he'll basically acquire now ownership of the goods. He'll acquire ownership of the goods. Then, as we've said, a hire purchase contract must actually be registered under the Hire Purchase Act. It is a requirement that the hire purchase contract should actually be registered within a period of 30 days. And what actually normally happens, the requirements is that this particular hire purchase contract should actually be formatted in an English language, registered within a period of 30 days of its creation. Then, of course, what is important also, it is that there will be the requirement to be able to pay what we call a stamp duty when this hire purchase contract is actually being registered, Failure to register the hire purchase contract is not actually valid, and therefore it might become even very hard for the owner of the goods to be able to enforce certain terms under the contract. For example, he cannot actually be able to enforce maybe this particular hire purchase contract against the hirer. So any amounts which have not actually been paid maybe by the guarantor cannot actually be enforced in case this hire purchase contract is not actually registered. It is not actually registered. So it is important that it is actually registered. So the contents of the hire purchase agreement, we've said, for example, it will have the details of the parties. So that is the hirer and the owner of the goods. It will have the cash price and the hire purchase price. Will actually be indicated there. It will indicate basically when the installments actually fall due and what are the amounts in terms of installments. So when are they actually falling due? When are they actually falling due? So those will be part of the contents of what you are calling a hire purchase agreement. So that is the end of this particular topic. So I don't know if Becky, you have any question? Even though you've just joined a bit late. I joined a bit late. Do you have any question, Becky?
No, I don't have.
Sawa. So maybe what I'll do, I'll try and see if I can be able to maybe share the video from the start, from where I started this particular lesson of hire purchase. So I'll share with you. Then you can actually be able to watch from the start until up to this particular point where I'm going to end the class. I'm going to end the class. That is okay.